Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916. Dublin, Ireland. A group of roughly 1,200 men and women seized the center of the capital city of the British Empire's closest neighbor. They held it for 6 days. Then they surrendered, and Britain crushed them, arrested them, executed their leaders in a cold courtyard, one by one, over 10 days. And here's the thing everyone knows. That decision, those executions, turned a failed rebellion into a revolution. It handed the Irish Republican movement the greatest propaganda victory in its history. Britain looked brutal, heavy-handed, and within 6 years, Ireland was free. But here's the question nobody asks. Why didn't Britain just let it go? Why not negotiate? Why not ignore it? Why not treat it as the military embarrassment it actually was? A tiny uprising that failed in less than a week, and move on? Because they had every reason to. Today, using advanced AI technology, we are bringing why the British Empire refused to abandon Dublin during the 1916 Rising in full color for the first time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The timing was catastrophic. Britain was 2 years into the bloodiest war in human history. They had hundreds of thousands of men dying in French trenches. The last thing they needed was a PR disaster at home. They could have been merciful. History shows they were capable of it. So why weren't they? The answer to that question tells you everything. Not just about 1916, not just about Ireland, but about how empires think, how they calculate, and how they destroy themselves trying to survive. To understand why Britain reacted the way it did to the Easter Rising, you have to understand what Britain was in 1916. The British Empire was the largest empire in human history. At its peak, it controlled roughly 24% of the world's land surface and 23% of the global population. 1 in 4 human beings on Earth lived under the Union Jack. India, Egypt, South Africa, Canada, Australia, Nigeria, Hong Kong. The list goes on. And holding all of it together required one thing above everything else: the appearance of invincibility. Empires don't run on armies alone. They run on psychology, on the idea, the belief, that resistance is futile, that the empire is permanent, that it cannot be beaten. The moment that idea cracked, the whole thing was in danger. Now imagine you're a British general in April 1916. You are fighting Germany on the Western Front. You have already lost over 400,000 men. The Battle of the Somme, one of the deadliest battles in human history, is 3 months away. And then you get a telegram. Dublin is burning. Armed rebels have taken the General Post Office. They've declared an Irish Republic. And somewhere in India, in a newspaper, in a tea house, in a marketplace, someone reads about it. Someone in Egypt reads about it. And they ask the same question. If the Irish can do it, why can't we? This is the domino that Britain was terrified of. Not Dublin. Dublin was a minor city, a manageable problem. It was the signal Dublin would send to every colonized nation on Earth that made it existential. But there's another layer here that most people miss entirely. 1916 was not just any year. It was the middle of the First World War, and Ireland's relationship to that war was deeply, dangerously complicated. For 2 years, Britain had been recruiting Irish men into the British Army, promising them things. Specifically, promising them home rule, a form of limited self-governance, once the war was won. Around 200,000 Irish men had enlisted, were fighting, dying, in British uniforms. And now, while those men were dying for Britain and France, their countrymen were rising up against Britain at home. That is a political nightmare of the highest order. If Britain appeared weak, if they negotiated with the rebels or showed leniency, What message did that send to every Irish soldier on the Western Front? What message did it send to every other army Britain was relying on? The Indian Corps, the African units, the Anzacs. Could Britain afford to look like it could be pressured, like it could be defied? The answer, in 1916, was absolutely not. Let's talk about what the Easter Rising actually was, because most people have a romanticized version in their heads. The truth is messier, more human, and in many ways, more remarkable. The men and women who took part were led by a small group of revolutionary organizations, primarily the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army. Their leaders included Patrick Pearse, a schoolteacher and poet, James Connolly, a socialist trade unionist, Thomas Clark, a veteran Fenian who had spent 15 years in British prisons. They were not professional soldiers. They were teachers, poets, trade unionists, shop workers, and on Easter Monday morning, they walked into the center of Dublin and declared a republic, in the name of God and of the dead generations. The plan, such as it was, had already started to unravel before a shot was fired. A shipment of German weapons, 20,000 rifles on a ship called the EUD, had been intercepted by the British Navy. The leader of the Irish Volunteers, Owen McNeill, had published a countermanding order in the newspaper, canceling the rising, when he found out it was happening without full support. The result was chaos. Many units never mobilized. The rising that took place was a fraction of what was planned. And yet, on Easter Monday, roughly 1,200 men and women took 16 strategic buildings and positions across Dublin. The most iconic was the General Post Office on Sackville Street, today's O'Connell Street, which became the rebels' headquarters. Patrick Pearse stood outside and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic to a crowd of confused Dubliners. The reaction from ordinary Dubliners was not what the rebels had hoped. Many were hostile. Others were simply baffled. Some shouted abuse. A few threw rotten vegetables. This was not a people's uprising. It was a deliberate act by a small revolutionary vanguard who believed, who knew, that Ireland was not yet ready to rise. But who rose anyway? Because they believed that the act itself would awaken something. They were right, but not in the way they expected. The British response was initially slow and confused. It was Easter weekend. Senior commanders were at the races. Communication lines were disrupted. But when the machinery of empire finally moved, it moved decisively. Within 24 hours, 16,000 British troops had been deployed to Dublin. Artillery was brought in. The gunboat Helga sailed up the Liffey and shelled Liberty Hall. Street by street, block by block, British forces tightened the cordon. The GPO was set ablaze. Sackville Street, Dublin's grandest boulevard, was reduced to rubble. Whole city blocks burned. By Saturday, April 29th, Pearse issued the order to surrender. To prevent further slaughter of civilians, he said, the rising was over. The rebels were marched through the streets of Dublin. And again, the public reaction was striking. Many Dubliners were angry. They jeered. They threw things. These rebels had destroyed their city, caused food shortages, got civilians killed in the crossfire. In terms of popular support, the rising had failed completely. And this is exactly where Britain made the worst decision in its long history of bad decisions in Ireland. So we've established what the rising was. Now let's answer the central question. Why couldn't Britain simply absorb this? Arrest the ringleaders, imprison them, and move on? There were 3 reasons, and they all fed into each other. Britain was not just governing Ireland. It was governing a quarter of the world. And the logic of empire is brutally simple. You cannot show weakness anywhere, because weakness everywhere follows. General John Maxwell, the British commander sent to Dublin to restore order, understood this completely. He was not thinking about Dublin. He was thinking about Delhi, about Cairo, about Nairobi. Leniency in Dublin meant rebellion in Lagos. Negotiation in Dublin meant negotiation in Calcutta. This was not paranoia. It was the cold mathematics of imperial control. Britain had already seen what happened when that logic broke down. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Jamaican Morant Bay Uprising of 1865, the Boer War just 15 years earlier. Every time, the lesson Britain drew was the same: show strength. Never negotiate from weakness. It was a doctrine. And in April 1916, that doctrine overrode everything else. There was another pressure that history sometimes glosses over, and it was entirely domestic. Ireland in 1916 was not a unified country. The Northeast, Ulster, had a large Protestant, Unionist population who were fiercely opposed to any form of Irish self-government. These were people who considered themselves British, who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom, and they had already demonstrated they were willing to fight for it. In 1912, 237,000 Ulster men had signed the Ulster Covenant, in some cases in their own blood, pledging to resist Home Rule by any means necessary. They had formed a paramilitary army, the Ulster Volunteer Force, with 100,000 members. Britain faced a paradox. If it was too lenient with the Catholic, nationalist rebels in the south, it risked a Protestant, Unionist rebellion in the north. If it was too hard on the nationalist rebels, it risked turning all of Catholic Ireland against the crown. There was no good option. There was only the least bad option. And the Conservative Party, which had a coalition agreement with the Liberal government of Herbert Asquith, was the party of Ulster Unionism. They were not going to tolerate any deal that looked like rewarding rebellion. So the political space for leniency simply didn't exist. The final reason is the most human, and in some ways the most tragic. General John Maxwell was a career soldier, a man shaped by the logic of colonial military command. When he arrived in Dublin on April 28th, even before the rising had fully ended, he was given near absolute power to deal with the situation as he saw fit. And he saw it the only way he knew how to see it, as a military problem requiring a military solution. Prime Minister Asquith was not strong enough to overrule him. His government was already weakened. He was managing a coalition under wartime pressure. He needed the Conservatives. He needed the generals. He couldn't afford a fight on the Irish question as well. So the executions were approved, not out of hatred, not out of malice, out of institutional momentum, out of the grinding logic of systems that no individual felt empowered to stop. This is something James Connolly, one of the executed leaders, understood even before it happened. He reportedly told a fellow prisoner, "They'll shoot us all. They have to." He was right. Between May 3rd and May 12th, 1916, 15 men were executed at Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, shot at dawn in the Stonebreakers Yard. One by one: Patrick Pearse, Thomas Clark, Thomas MacDonough, Joseph Plunkett, who had been granted permission to marry his fiancée, Grace Gifford, in his prison cell hours before his death, Edward Daly, William Pierce, Michael O'Hanrahan, John McBride, Eamon Sant, Michael Mallon, Con Colbert, Sean Houston, Sean MacDiarmida, and James Connolly, who was so badly wounded he could not stand and was tied to a chair to be shot. 97 more were sentenced to death, including a young man named Eamon de Valera, who would later become the dominant political figure in Irish history for half a century. Most of those sentences were commuted, but the executions that did happen, those 15 deaths spread over 10 days, were a catastrophe of perception. Because here's what Britain didn't understand. They thought they were extinguishing a fire. They were pouring petrol on it. Watch how public opinion moved. Before the executions, the rising was widely unpopular in Ireland. The rebels had caused destruction, disrupted ordinary life, and failed militarily. Many Irish people, including many nationalists, were embarrassed by it. Then the executions began. The newspapers started printing the final letters the condemned men had written to their families. Their last words, their prayers, the accounts of their dignity in facing death. Joseph Plunkett, married at midnight and shot at dawn. James Connolly, so severely wounded he had to be shot in a chair. And something shifted. These men who had been dismissed as foolish idealists, they became martyrs. And in Ireland, a country steeped in a history of martyrdom, nothing is more powerful than a martyr. The poet W.B. Yeats captured it perfectly. In his great poem Easter, 1916, he wrote that everything had changed, that a terrible beauty had been born. Public opinion in Ireland turned, not overnight, but steadily, irreversibly, against British rule. The moderate Irish Parliamentary Party, which had spent decades working within the British system for gradual reform, found itself being overtaken by Sinn Féin and the demand for full independence. In the 1918 general election, held just 2 years after the Rising, Sinn Féin won 73 of Ireland's 105 Westminster seats. They refused to take their seats in London. They set up their own parliament in Dublin, the Dáil. The Irish War of Independence began. By 1922, the Irish Free State existed. 26 of Ireland's 32 counties were independent. Britain had crushed a rebellion of 1,200 people and created a nation. So, why did Britain refuse to abandon Dublin? Because it couldn't. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. It was trapped by the logic of empire, by the politics of war, by the institutional momentum of systems that no individual was powerful enough to stop. Every decision that led to the executions made complete sense within the framework Britain was operating in. And every decision was wrong. This is what historians sometimes call the Tsar Nicholas problem. The last Tsar of Russia made decisions that were perfectly rational given his worldview. And his worldview was so detached from reality that his rational decisions led directly to the Bolshevik Revolution and his own death. Britain in 1916 had the same problem. The framework was the problem. The empire's survival instinct, the thing that was supposed to protect it, is what accelerated its decline. Not just in Ireland. Eventually, everywhere. India watched 1916. Egypt watched 1916. Across the empire, people noticed that the system could be challenged, that the myth of British invincibility had a crack in it. The Irish Free State was established in 1922. Indian independence came in 1947. The empire was largely gone by 1970. The 1916 Rising failed. And in failing, in being crushed, in being martyred, in being mishandled by the most powerful empire on earth, it succeeded beyond anything its leaders could have imagined. Because they understood something that Britain didn't. You don't have to beat an empire. You just have to make it defeat itself. If this story moved you, like this video and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history the way you do.